Well, hello everyone around the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as appropriate. And welcome to the Global Spaceport Alliance monthly webinar. My name is James Causey, Executive Director of the Global Spaceport Alliance, and we have a very, very exciting program for you today. Let me just run you through quickly the agenda that we've set up for you. I'm going to talk briefly about some activities that Steve and I have been undergoing over the last several weeks. Then George, as always, will do an overview keynote for us, and then introduce our today's keynote speaker, Charity Whedon. In the last couple of weeks, Steve and I have been working extensively with spaceports and membership around the world. And as many of you have probably identified, there's an awful lot happening right now. And George, I'm sure, will overview some aspects of that. But we've been talking with Australia, we've been talking with the UK, with Canada, Argentina, Brazil, and in all of these discussions about the value of GSA membership, several things have sort of started to emerge that we just wanted to punctuate with everybody in the conversation we have today. You know, as we look at the GSA, it's a membership group, and it's about creating a community, and that establishes all the linkages and partnerships associated with that community. But one of the deepest values that we've identified as we've gone through all of the discussions that we've been having has been in the working groups that we've set up for the members to actually discuss amongst themselves key issues that are really pressing, and sharing those things with one another. And the 5 working groups that we've set up have all been active for over a year now, and have done some really, really exciting work. As we go over the next several months, we're likely to be getting specific reports in from those working groups to just let us know exactly where they are. One of the other things that we found is that in our discussions, the array of different ways that spaceports operate generally, and very specifically how they look at revenue streams that are not necessarily launch related, is something that's emerging very rapidly. And so we're very keen to just remind everyone that that's another value of membership in our group. You know, last year, George Neal put together the National Spaceport Network Development Plan, which was distributed to FAA and a variety of other sources. And it's illustrative of the type of thing that GSA also does as part of the value proposition of membership. And then finally, you all receive our monthly newsletter, which is a really interesting and up-to-date sort of news flash of what's happening in the spaceport community. And this represents also an opportunity for members to showcase for us, and for the membership, of course, exactly what's going on in their markets and in their specific spaceports. Now, in the last, I guess it was about 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, we had a really great call with Air Liquide, and in that conversation, it became apparent that there could be some advantage to GSA in establishing a new working group. And in discussions with George and Steve and myself and Bob, we concluded that we will be forming a new working group on public policy. And in some regards, for those of you who have not done this yet, please link onto our website and go to George's report on the Spaceport Network Development Plan, And in that, he keynotes and highlights several specific initiatives that really would be valuable for us to potentially help just move along in some creative fashion. And so some of the focus of that public policy working group will be around those issues. Okay, for now, all I would also like you to do is if you are in the renewal process, please begin to start thinking about renewing your membership. And also for those of you on the call, we have sent out some invitations to non-members to participate today to get a flavor of what GSA is all about. And we encourage you all to join. And just as sort of a quick reminder, there are 3 classes of membership. A full member is a spaceport facility. The second type is an associate member, a company that actually wants to do work specifically with a spaceport. And then the third class is sort of an academic nonprofit government membership. So please go to our website, check it all out, renew now or join now. With that said, I'd like to move into the main guts of the presentation and turn it over to George Neild, our chair and president of the Commercial Space Technologies LLC. George, over to you.
Thank you, James. Well, there is certainly a lot going on these days in commercial space, especially items that are of interest to the spaceport community. I think it's interesting just to periodically review some of what's been going on because it's all happening so quickly. We have a tendency maybe to not appreciate the speed at which things are going on. So just since the beginning of May, we've seen a number of announcements and accomplishments. The Crew 1 mission by SpaceX ended successfully with a splashdown of 4 astronauts in the Gulf of Mexico on the 1st of May. Down at the Johnson Space Center, the director there, Mark Geyer, announced that he was stepping down to focus more time on health and family in light of a recent cancer diagnosis. And Vanessa Weish will be the acting director there. So we have a great relationship with her, and she's been very supportive of our activities in the past. On May the 3rd, of course, Bill Nelson was sworn in as the new NASA administrator. On the 5th, SpaceX conducted a successful test flight of its Starship SN-15 down at Boca Chica, including the launch and hover and reorientation and landing. So a lot going on there in Texas. On the 5th of May, Blue Origin began the auction for its July 20th flight of New Shepard, which will be the first one carrying people. And the high bids for that auction were made public starting on May 19th, and they rapidly started to increase. Bidding continues with the current high bid being $2.8 million for a single seat there. And the auction is scheduled to conclude on June the 12th, so it may go even higher. So that'll be interesting to follow. The next day, Boeing announced that they're targeting July 30th for their Orbital Flight Test 2 test of their Starliner spacecraft for the Commercial Crew program for NASA, scheduled to go to the International Space Station. On the 8th, Elon Musk was the host of that Saturday Night Live, so it's always interesting to see how some of our industry figures interact with the general public. On the 6th, Boeing announced, we talked about Starliner tests. Let's see, on May the 9th, China's Long March 5 completed an uncontrolled reentry. So a lot are wondering about where that was going to come down and how could that be allowed, and is that appropriate norm of behavior in terms of how we like to operate in space? It caused a lot of discussion after that. On the 10th, Bob Cabana was announced as the new Associate Administrator of NASA following the retirement of Steve Jurczyk. Of course, Bob has led the Kennedy Space Center for a number of years and has really been instrumental in helping that to become a true multi-user spaceport. On May 10th, NASA had a press conference announcing the signing of a mission order for Axiom to fly a private astronaut mission to the International Space Station. That's scheduled to be probably not earlier than January of 2022, so a lot of interest there. Then on the 13th, Space Adventure announced that Yusaku Maezawa, whom you may have heard of from his Dear Moon program, in which he's hoping to fly on a Starship flight around the moon in a few years, but it was announced recently that he'll be flying on a Russian Soyuz to the International Space Station in December. So the Russians too are starting to get back into the civilian astronaut activities. Then Russia announced that they've selected an actress and a film director to fly to the International Space Station in October. On May the 14th, China landed a rover on Mars. A lot of neat pictures coming back from that. On the 18th, the Discovery Network announced a new TV competition series in which a so-called everyday person will be traveling to the ISS. So we'll be watching that for more details. On the 20th, Congress had a confirmation hearing for Pam Milroy, who's been nominated to serve as the Deputy NASA Administrator. And a vote on that is expected soon. On the 22nd, Virgin Galactic successfully completed the first flight of Spaceship 2 to space from Spaceport America. So a big milestone there for that company and that spaceport. On the 25th, Axiom announced that former Chief of the Astronaut Office at NASA, Peggy Whitson, will be the commander of the second private astronaut mission to the space station if the company is selected by NASA for that activity. And then just yesterday, Lockheed Martin and General Motors announced that they're teaming up to build a human lunar terrain vehicle, basically an autonomous rover that could carry people around on the moon. No NASA requirements yet on that, but already industry is trying to figure out what they need to do and what some of the great options are. So that's just in the month of May, pretty busy. A lot of things going on right now. We are very fortunate today to have a chance to hear about spaceports and how we can influence and engage with the FAA's Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, or COMSTAC. COMSTAC was established back in 1984 to provide information and advice and recommendations to the Secretary of Transportation through the FAA Administrator on all matters relating to U.S. commercial space transportation industry activities. So today we are very fortunate to have Charity Whedon, who serves as the chair of COMSTAC, to speak to us about how spaceports can become more engaged with and supportive of COMSTAC's activities. Now, because she also serves as the Vice President of Global Space Policy at Astroscale US, we also have an opportunity to hear about some of the company's plans for active debris removal, as well as her thoughts on the status of global space situational awareness capabilities. So just a little bit more about Charity. She brings a rich experience as an operator, manager, diplomat, and advocate for the space community. Prior to Astroscale, she established a consulting company dedicated to supporting new space companies navigating the U.S. regulatory environment. She was previously the Senior Director of Policy at the Satellite Industry Association, responsible for advancing U.S. satellite industry interests in government services, regulatory, legislative, defense, export control, and trade. Prior to SIA, she served as the Canadian Embassy Assistant Attaché for Air and Space Operations, where she facilitated Royal Canadian Air Force space engagements with the U.S. government, industry, and the embassy community. She's a 23-year veteran of the RCAF, starting her career as a CP-140, which we know as the P3 Maritime Patrol Air Navigator, conducting airborne maritime surveillance operations, followed by assignments as Deputy Sensor Manager for the U.S. Space Surveillance Network at U.S. Air Force Space Command, a policy officer at NORAD and U.S. NORTHCOM, and as Flight Support Operations Manager at the Canadian Space Agency. So as I mentioned, she's currently serving also as the chair of the FAA Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee and is a fellow at the Canadian Government Global Affairs Institute. And she also volunteers as a mentor for the Brooke Owens Fellowship. Charity received her undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering from the Royal Military College of Canada and a master's degree in space science from the University of North Dakota. She's an alumnus of the International Space University Summer Session Program. Charity, thank you so much for talking to us today. Over to you. Okay, and it looks like you're still muted, Charity. Just click on the green mic right above the camera. Okay. So under the orange arrow, do you see a microphone symbol to click to make it green?
Hey, Charity, you look like you were good before. Looks like your mic is fine. Were you using just try using the computer microphone?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that. That's weird. So apologies, and just 1 second as I get set up here. Thank you, everyone, for the kind invitation today to all the Global Spaceport Alliance members, to Dr. Neild. This is a real honor to be here, and you are the experts in spaceports, so I'm actually looking forward to hearing from you and having a good dialogue going. Before we get started, I wanted to take the opportunity to tell you, these are, while I'm here as chair of COMSTAC, these are my views, not of FAA or the collective point of view from the membership, although I'm happy to bring updates of what we're working on. I'm also proud of the diverse membership and range of opinions and insights on the COMSTAC membership. There are 2 direct spaceport members, but also many, many others that have firsthand knowledge and experience. So we rely greatly on a wealth of expertise. I want to tell you a little bit about my day job. Normally, when I speak to folks, I can't help it but start talking about space sustainability regardless. But there's more in common with spaceports here than you think. Ultimately, what we aim to do at Astroscale is enable the safe and sustainable space operations. And hopefully that sounds familiar. It's hopefully a goal of the spaceport community as well. And therefore, we want to provide accessibility to space through the development of a logistics infrastructure in orbit to service spacecraft, just like commercial spaceports here on Earth, enabling a robust and successful space economy. On-orbit services are emerging and opening a new market. These technologies to extend lives of satellites, hasten disposal, remediate debris, and more are necessary to reach that trillion-dollar space economy we all look forward to. With that, I'm going to switch over to some slides here. You will indulge me for a second. Okay, you should see my screen. Can someone give me a thumbs up? Okay, yes. Great, thank you. Again, the Astroscale Vision, oops, sorry about that, is to provide, move that out of the way, is to provide a safe and sustainable development of space for future generations. We do this in 3 manners. We build technology, we support the development of policies, and we also need to identify the business cases, because this is a new market, as I tell you. And the last 6 decades, we've been using space, humanity has been using space without regard to its value to clean orbits. And so that's an important item to identify. We want to make space systems sustainable, cost-effective, and successful. That's the bottom line. So here are a few of our mission sets. One which is in orbit today. The first being life extension, geostationary orbit satellites, those that may just simply run out of fuel. We are able to launch and rendezvous with the satellite and provide a attitude control to extend its life. In situ space situational awareness or inspection services, when one has a servicing operation and wants to rendezvous with another object in space, you have to do that very carefully. You need sensor technology on board. And so this is a natural mission set to be able to safely from a distance inspect other satellites, consensually, of course, and to understand if the object is tumbling, the material analysis of the object as well, to make sure it's safe to rendezvous and capture it. Next up is simple Delta V services. If one can capture an object and dispose of it safely into the atmosphere, one can do the opposite and raise its orbit or change its orbit. And so those are the sort of services we're looking to provide as well. Active debris removal. Now what this is capturing and disposing of large objects that were not planned or prepared to be captured. So we'd have to very carefully take a look at the technical aspects of where it is safe to capture these large objects, like those upper stage rocket bodies. And currently our Astroscale Japan colleagues have a contract to conduct that in situ inspection of an upper stage, but hopefully the second part of that contract, we will be able to provide the active debris removal of an upper stage. And last but certainly not least, this is the one that's in orbit today, the end of life services by Astroscale. And what this mission does is for prepared satellites, those with a lightweight docking plate made of a ferrous material, lightweight, inexpensive, Astroscale can provide a servicer to go up and rendezvous, capture that spacecraft should it fail in orbit prematurely, and dispose of it safely into the atmosphere. And so we are in the midst of a demonstration mission that launched in March for this service. Very exciting. The demonstration will be 3 steps. The first just separating with our dummy debris, which is actually an active satellite. So you can see the small little circle on that. That is the docking plate. And then it will also capture it tumbling, and while not tumbling, and also have a search and rescue package on it, should we lose sight of the object. So very exciting times. This is not only new, but needed technology to help us maintain the orbital environment. A little bit about Astroscale itself. 200 employees worldwide, multiple locations around the world. This is a global problem that requires a global presence. We are well-funded. Investors see the value and the opportunity in space sustainability, which is great to see. And as I mentioned before, we want to develop the technology, inform policy, and advance the business case. If you are interested, and I can leave these slides with you, the concept of operations for the LCD in orbit today is live on YouTube. You can take a look, not live on YouTube, but there's an animation that you can take a look. It's very interesting of how it's going to conduct these demonstrations. And again, it was launched in March. As I said, quick and dirty of what Astroscale is. We are maybe new to the industry, but on-orbit services are absolutely required for the growth of this industry as well. And so I'm going to escape from the presentation. And a couple more points here, and then maybe we can move on to spaceport related items. Just a couple points here that looking at the Global Space Alliance or Spaceport Alliance summit notes from last year, I see several common themes with the space sustainability message. I see transparency as a common theme, predictability of the environment and the regulatory environment, interoperability, fair governance, and I was really thrilled to see a recognition of space sustainability. Astroscale US, we're growing rapidly. 2 years ago, opened the company in Denver, Colorado, and I was the lone person here in Washington, DC. I can tell you that, you know, we're shopping around for office space right now, and I am looking at several places, and the ones that stand out to me, they have that LEEDs building, you know, sticker on the outside that tells me that they're using sustainable practices. And I see this as an economic delineator between a sustainable spaceport or sustainable orbital services versus those that are doing the status quo. And I have to wonder how spaceports in the future will future-proof themselves to be competitive for sustainable practices. What customers do you want to attract? And this is also about economic sustainability as well, as you know. And maybe certainly something your new public policy working group may want to tackle. So please let me know how I can help. To shift gears now, I do have a few comments back to Spaceports and COMSTAC's overall role. I have a few items that we are working on that would be of interest to the Spaceport Alliance. One is the Spaceport Grants tasker that we have. Last year, COMSTAC was tasked to recommend changes, if any, to the existing space transportation infrastructure matching grants program. We were tasked to define how this program or similar spaceport infrastructure might work, what is the eligibility criteria, and preferred funding sources. We had kind of a high level recommendation that the US government create a federal program for funding improvements at spaceports. This would be STIM-like, that Space Transportation Infrastructure Matching Program, until there is enough launch activity to make sense for more of an airport improvement like funding. So we have a part 2 of this tasker ongoing right now that we will provide updates in the next public meeting, I would presume sometime in the fall. And that is to dive more into more detail on what entities would qualify for such a STIM funding source and what are the criteria. So not necessarily focusing on the source of funds for this, but how they would be divvied up. And recognizing that clearly there's some congressional input here that needs to be understood. The other thing tracking is, and maybe for the dialogue, is how the Infrastructure and Jobs Bill is thinking for commercial spaceports. I see there is some mention of it, but not necessarily, and to my knowledge, I'm not seeing a lot of plus up for infrastructure dedicated to spaceports, not yet. Maybe you know more about that than I do then. Moving on to the second topic that COMSTAC is tackling as a task is the National Spaceport Authority, which has been renamed a Range Infrastructure Task. So this is essentially to provide input on the DoD's eastern and western ranges and what that looks like in the future to enable commercial launch while serving the national security needs as well. So we were to familiarize ourselves with the evolving changes that are happening on the eastern and western ranges. We're going to compose a broad list of commercial space transportation industry stakeholders that should be included. We're going to broadly, define categories of spaceport facilities and services and list some general challenges. And this is the really key thing. for this tasker, we're not going to provide solutions here. We have to look at what are those hurdles for the future, range of the future, and the future use of the eastern and western ranges. So that is the goal here, is to find what those hurdles are. And we will be consulting with COMSTAC stakeholders for this tasker and collect feedback on how any governance changes at these sites may positively or negatively affect their operations. So times like today, talking to the GSA, or separately, this is going to be really valuable input as we look at this tasker. I'm seeing a lot of challenges with this, and that's good. I tend to attack problems with understanding you have the unknown unknowns where you don't even know it's an issue. I want to get to the known unknowns so we know where the problems are so we can tackle them one by one. So things that from my viewpoint, that are challenges for this tasker is ensuring that all equities are represented. So it is a complex issue. There are many, many equities, commercial, government, and private spaceports alike. The Eastern Range infrastructure is shared with NASA. And so how does that work? I think that is going to be a big challenge and something that we'll probably want to dig into. I'm aware that there are financing and bond issues related to spaceports that, the Eastern and Western ranges, how does that work? The clarity and expectations of private enterprises on these ranges. How this affects private and commercial spaceports. One ecosystem, right? And that economic sustainable model that this isn't just a one and done, that, spaceports and ranges can be economically sustainable for the future. And of course, those externalities like climate change and environmental issues and the national airspace, the integration of the NAS. These are all really, really important issues to think of when there's a large scale effort to understand in 15, 20 years what our spaceport's going to look like across the US specifically. So some of those are high level thoughts I have on that tasker. The third tasker I want to relay to you. Last year we were tasked to take a look at spaceport regulation. However, we have a very robust agenda at COMSTAC, and our regulatory lineup, if you will, was fully focused on Part 450, and it still is. The next regulatory item that is in priority for us is the Part 440 insurance requirements. So we will eventually get back to the spaceport regulation piece, but again, this is something that I feel that your group would be really welcome to provide inputs ahead of time before we get back into that. A fourth, I only have 5 here, so we can get into Q&A later. A fourth, it might be relevant to this community, is the R&D topics tasker that we just completed this spring. We found that we did some surveys of what from the commercial industry, spaceport or space transportation industry, what R&D topics are of interest to them. Number 1 was regulatory and policy research. So this might be something where spaceports, there might be something here that can be matched and support spaceport regulation or policy. The second was space transportation vehicle research, the third being advancement of the space launch integration into the national airspace system. Aerospace physiology was of interest, and space situational awareness research was of interest. With the increasing congestion of the orbits and the tightening of launch times and launch windows due to the integration into the air system, this is going to be a really important item to make sure that launch is effectively managed. So there might be something here. So we provided those recommendations to the FAA on those R&D topics. And one that we are working on right now, not related to R&D, mind you, but could be, is examining how a fully electronic license application system might work for the FAA. So we will be recommending best practices and industry preferences here. And I have to wonder what within the spaceport community we could lean on for some interesting best practices or preferences. So we'll be providing recommendations on that in the fall. Overall observations I am seeing as part of the COMSTAC membership and Spaceports and commercial launch activity, it's just growing so rapidly. And there are real efforts to prepare and ensure the safety and success of commercial space transportation, which is very heartening. And spaceports are literally on the map now. If you've seen that, they're on the flight hubs, which is exciting. You know, I have to wonder, will differences between, now I'm used to the airport infrastructure and how that all works, but what are those differences between airport and spaceports, and how does it help the spaceport or the space launch industry grow versus how airport structures help the airlines grow? I'm really interested in that question of those differences between the two models. And to what extent can spaceport operators enhance safety of commercial launch? How can they be more involved in the ground and spaceflight safety pieces? And to what extent can we design spaceports to seamlessly integrate into the NAS? So these are all just questions that continue in my mind, and I am very open to hearing suggestions and reading suggestions as well to get a little more smarter on this. How can you get involved? So reaching out to COMSTAC is fairly easy. Any of our members want to hear from you. So there's the membership list online. You can certainly reach out to me at any time. Karina Dries, many of you know her, and she's now the president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. She is the vice chair of COMSTAC and will take over as the chair next spring. Public meetings are a great place to provide presentation materials and comments, and just a continuous education to us and to help us foresee what is needed, say 3 to 5 years in the future, because that seems to be the sweet spot of where the FAA is looking next. What do they need to prepare for? What kind of resources do they need to drum up? What kind of congressional support? That is about a 3 to 5 year lag. So think about that time frame when we were working on issues today. I'm going to pause there. I know I've provided a lot of kind of, material to you, both on space sustainability, on the items that COMSTAC is working. I've peppered you with a few questions. I have some others, but I'll pause there and see if there are any questions so far for me.
Thanks, Charity. That was a great intro to a lot of the things that are going on right now. Let me encourage all of those who are listening in right now that might have questions. Feel free to go ahead and type those into the question box, and that way we'll be able to address those as we go forward in the rest of our time here. Maybe let me just start with one, Charity. A lot of the taskers that you mentioned seem really relevant and appropriate, and I think they'll help a lot when we get there. But I guess one of my most basic questions is, what can we as a community do to try to accelerate the rate of progress so that this whole activity is moving more at the speed of industry than at the speed of government? If we're talking about an organization that, I know there's work in between, but basically there's meetings every 6 months, that sets a pretty slow, steady pace to some of these, whereas some of the things like infrastructure. I mean, Congress is moving out right now to do stuff on infrastructure. Is there any way the aerospace community can prioritize the things that we really need as a first tranche, or just to get started? Another example related to this, as you know, Congress tasked the FAA to come up with a report on national spaceport policy as part of the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018, and that was due in October of 2019. So here we're a year and a half late, and oh, by the way, Congress wants an update on that report in October 2021. So the update is coming up in a few months, but I don't believe the original report has made it out of the coordination cycle yet. So, I mean, there's lots of constraints, there's lots of wickets, they have to follow the processes, get that. But in the meantime, is there anything that the COMSTAC can do, that GSA can do, that the aerospace community can do, either in public or frankly going direct to Congress if they're not getting the kind of information they need to make these decisions? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, very good questions, George. And you're right to point out that COMSTAC public meetings are twice a year. So we are constrained by FACA rules here a little bit. And we are also constrained by our day jobs and focus for these specific taskers. However, that doesn't mean COMSTAC is the only and only authoritative industry input here. Obviously, GSA can make its mark as well. As you mentioned, going straight to Congress, they're also straight to the FAA, as these are works in progress. I have to wonder if there are enough resources available, human resources, to tackle multiple issues at the same time and to work at the speed of industry, as you said. I think that is possibly at the heart of why things run so slowly. So while I don't have a perfect answer for you on that, I think industry is, by being safe and making sure that they are helping move things along, it actually motivates, I feel, the FAA to move a little quicker, because they do recognize that this is outpacing their capability right now.
Is there anything you can share with us in terms of the status of that National Spaceport Range of the Future engagement? I think at one time, Space Force was going to convene some government representatives to have a discussion on that, and I believe at the last COMSTAC meeting there was a thought, you know, maybe the FAA could help move that along in terms of not being in charge of everything, but at least facilitating some of the engagements and collecting of opinions. Any additional updates that you're familiar with along those lines?
The only updates I have are we're continuing to gather information to identify those hurdles, as I pointed out. We're talking to all stakeholders here, whether the DoD, NASA. As you saw, NASA had a briefing at the last COMSTAC on this issue as well, which was well received. And while I don't have an update on what is this structure going to look like, I just don't think there's interagency consensus on what that structure looks like. And we need to gather the facts first before we put forward recommendations.
Okay. If we were to try to prioritize some of the ideas that our membership has been talking about over the last few years, I think they would consist of the importance and the value of coming to a consensus on a national spaceport policy. You know, what kinds of things do we as a nation want to be doing and supporting in general, so that people recognize that this is an appropriate and helpful activity. Second would be coming to some agreement on what can we do in terms of spaceport infrastructure funding. Third, and I think you may have heard this through other sources, there's a lot of interest in, yeah, launches are great, and eventually there'll be rockets taken off from a lot of different places, but having high performance aircraft offering human spaceflight training opportunities would be a boon to spaceports that have runways. And so if, for example, Congress were willing to allow the Office of Commercial Space Transportation at the FAA approve under an informed consent regime people buying tickets to fly in L-39s or F-104s or T-38s or whatever would be available, that could really provide jobs, activity, increased safety, a lot of potential benefits for the spaceport community. And then finally, I think one of the top issues is the question of point-to-point transportation. A lot of interest in that, and that's pretty hard, and it's going to take a while and a lot of money and so forth. But even now, to the extent that we can start talking about approvals and maybe test corridors, or looking at what could we do to practice this from one spaceport to another spaceport, so that when we do have the vehicles that are capable of flying around the world in an hour or so, then we've worked out all the legal and regulatory and policy questions. And so I think that would be an area where I think the FAA and COMSTAC, through its membership, might be able to bring some focus in an area that would really pay some dividends. So again, those are four areas that I know we've been talking about in the past. If you had any either questions or comments or thoughts on any of those, that would certainly be of interest.
Yes, and I feel the interest of the COMSTAC community is matching very well here as well, with the hypersonic issue that's been brought up by one of our members, although it's not a full-on task yet. This sounds like it might be something that would work well in one of those research and development areas that the FAA is looking to invest in. So I would maybe encourage to look into that. Like you said, the infrastructure funding, that is top of our, one of the many priorities we have at the COMSTAC, and we're going to be providing more inputs to that formally to the FAA. So two really important items there. Yeah, so I feel we're aligned on that and those items, and I'll definitely take back your comments, George, to make sure that everyone is aware of those are the interests of the GSA as well.
Okay, that's great. And just to reemphasize, everybody has day jobs, and that's great. But if there's a way for you to leverage the broader community, if there are white papers or drafts or bullets or ideas or options that our community can collect for you or refine or try to put forward for you to consider, then that might sort of speed up the process and still ensure that you're hearing from all the stakeholders out there that you might not have already talked to. And so if you have ideas, whether it's a website or email or phone calls, whatever people prefer, happy to engage on a regular basis if it's helpful.
Yes, and thank you for that offer. I will certainly be taking you up on it. I know you provided the National Spaceport framework last year to us at COMSTAC, and I want to make sure that we have integrated that or at least absorbed a lot of those ideas. And I think the infrastructure, the funding for infrastructure is one sort of topic that we need to look closely at that paper and any other ideas you have on that. I'd also like to get a little more smarter on the hypersonics point-to-point infrastructure or transportation item. It is one of those horizon items that we don't want to get left or caught unguarded here. And if you have any kind of basic or materials that we can circulate to the COMSTAC membership, I would happy to do that. I would be thrilled to do that.
Sounds great. So just to follow up on that particular one, clearly, near term, there's interest by companies in flying supersonically and eventually hypersonically, and then maybe someday the point-to-point. But I think a helpful way to look at this might be to look at things in parallel or from a different perspective. A lot of the issues in terms of airspace and safety and regulatory planning applies no matter how fast you're really talking about. And so the same kinds of issues in terms of how do we ensure that this can be done safely, I think are very appropriate for the space side of the FAA to be thinking about and looking at, even if some of those initial vehicles aren't Mach 5, or if they're truly airplanes instead of launch vehicles. Because again, it might be something totally new. The Starship ideas that SpaceX is putting forward, I think, sort of leapfrog a lot of the expectations on what is that going to look like. Certainly many barriers still to overcome, not quite there yet, but the basic principles seem to be there that could provide very high-speed, long-distance transportation, certainly for cargo, maybe for 100 people or so even in the next bunch of years. And so, as you said, if we can start thinking about what is that going to take, what do we have to look at before we get to that point, that could really help. We've actually established a Global Spaceport Alliance working group specifically for the point-to-point transportation idea, and so have been talking with spaceports, local communities, and their government representatives on, maybe it would make sense to have a pilot program or a test area, not that covers everything everywhere, but say looking at from Midland Air and Spaceport to Spaceport America, and whether the vehicle is a jet, or it's a Spaceship 2, or it's some other type of system. What would that look like? And is there a way we can practice to start getting some experience and figure out where the tough parts are? So the idea of having, whether it's a test program or a working group or something, thinking about spaceport to spaceport fast transportation might be something that would be beneficial and wouldn't necessarily take a long time to set up.
I think what might be helpful is I'll have to check and see if our spaceport-centric COMSTAC members are part of the GSA. Do you know, George? Dale Nash? And
yes.
Okay, great. I'll want to kind of tap into that expertise and making sure we're tracking the dialogues that you guys are having, and making sure that's fed back into the membership. So I think that'll be important, just like we do with ASTM F47, the standards body there, and making sure we're having a consistent feedback loop, I think, into the COMSTAC membership. Do you think that would be helpful?
Yes, for sure. Excellent, thank you. Let's see, a few other areas. I know that there was
there's
recently,
one question here.
Let's see, there was an event recently where MITRE and CSF were trying to have a good discussion about human spaceflight research in terms of how we can move the ball there. Some interesting ideas on that. I don't know if that's an area of interest to Congress, to COMSTAC. So you mentioned the R&D physiology as being a potential subject.
And we're also continuing to look at voluntary standards for human spaceflight participant. I think that is always top of mind because of the moratorium potentially ending soon. So yeah, additional information as that comes along is important for us.
Excellent.
Hey, George and Charity, we do have a few questions in the question field. I don't know if you could see those, George, but
okay, so they don't show up. They don't show up for me. So if you see them, feel free to read them out. Or
I see one of them. I'm happy to answer. I don't know if there's any others. The question is, do you have any international outreach areas that might be of interest to the members? I can tell you that we recently provided recommendations on dual licensing requirements. Now, you know, for the space industry, duplication of licensing is really, really hard on the industry. Sucks up the resources. There could be conflicting regulation. We do encourage, you know, the government-to-government dialogue on ensuring that there's one set of rules. I know it's harder said than done, or harder, you know, it's easier said than done on that one. But we do have recommendations I can point you to on the dual licensing issue. And this might be important as new spaceports get licensed around the world, and if there are US entities that want to launch out of those spaceports.
Okay, any other questions out there?
And I'll just throw it out. Any insight regarding the National Space Council stand-up and addressing infrastructure agenda? You sort of touched on this, but this is from HR Zucker.
Hi, HR. So National Space Council, until they get an executive secretary, I don't think we're going to know exactly what the priorities here are, and for the vice president to get engaged on this as well. I think one thing that could be done is a review of the UAG and what sort of makeup and diverse makeup the UAG is consisting of. And so should infrastructure be a priority for the UAG or for National Space Council to look at that the UAG is fitted as a FACA to provide that input. Does that help?
Okay. So we have another message from Gennaro Russo and from Campania Aerospace District in Naples region of South Italy. He says, I'm sorry to say that I do not believe large P2P hypersonic airplanes will really arise in the next couple of decades. I do believe that there is much more space economically and market-wise to small hypersonic vehicles. What do you think about that? How do you think the actions in favor of spaceports will really evolve? So I know you've touched on this, but perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more for Gennaro.
Yes, I think it's dangerous to try and predict where the markets will flow and what kind of technology barriers will be broken. I feel that if we are going to invest in spaceport infrastructure, in enabling technology developments and research in all sorts of launch, including point-to-point, that, you know, let the investors and the market, you know, kind of help shape that as well. I'll never bet against the space industry because it always surprises me at every move. If you know, we had this conversation 3 years ago and someone said there'd be 4,000, you know, doubling of satellites in a year and a half, I would say that that's insane, but here we are. And ditto, I get this all the time of, you know, is the market ready for debris removal? You know, we're kind of in the same boat where it's a necessity and there's not a lot of economic research backing this up, but it is a necessity nonetheless. And, you know, we're seeing the regulatory future here as well that requires a remediation or at least increased mitigation of space debris. So generically, that's what I would say about point-to-point. I hope that answers somewhat your question.
Excellent, thanks. Looks like we're coming to the end of our time today, but Charity, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us today, and we look forward to engaging with you and the rest of the COMSTAC. If there are ways that we can help or things that we can do to support your very important mission there, please let us know. And James, I think we'll turn it back over to you for any closing comments you have.
Thank you.
You're muted, James. James, you're muted. Okay.
Steve,
there you go. Okay.
Steve is always concerned that I say too much, so he had me muted. Charity, I just want to echo George's comments. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I've made a list of half a dozen things that we need to follow up on based on your comments. That was absolutely terrific. So thank you so much. It's Thursday afternoon here in DC, and we're all getting ready for a Memorial Day weekend. I certainly hope you all, at least in the United States, have a fantastic Memorial weekend, and we look forward to seeing you all for the next webinar later on in June. Okay, so for now, thank you all very much. Bye.